Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, in collaboration with KlimateNet, a peer-to-peer network that incentivizes and connects professionals working on projects that reduce or remove global greenhouse gas emissions, I interview Hamish Jacobs. Hamish is the co-founder of the Good Fuel Group and was previously head of international sustainability and CSR at Didi and director of sustainability at Coca Cola China. Hamish founded the Good Fuel Group in 2011 to provide sustainability advisory and capital raising services to support companies on their transformation from a model of extraction to one that supports the global low-carbon transition. At Didi, a Chinese company providing app-based transportation services to Asian and Latin American markets, Hamish oversaw the company's global sustainability efforts in CSR. Hamish is stubbornly optimistic about technology's ability to deliver both the regenerative growth models needed to keep global warming below a 1.5 degrees increase, as well as a more equitable society. His key areas of focus include bioplastics, biodiesel, water, energy storage and management, renewables, and precision fermentation. Hamish and I discuss best practices for embedding sustainability into all aspects of a corporation, and Hamish also shares corporate success stories in his 20-plus year career in sustainability. Thank you for joining me today, Hamish, to talk about integrating sustainability and ESG into corporate strategies. I want to start out by asking you about your background. You've held various roles in sustainability, including at Coca Cola and Didi, as well as the company that you co-founded, the Good Fuel Group. How did you become interested in sustainability, both personally and professionally?
Emily, thanks so much for having me here today. It's a real treat to do this, and I appreciate it. On the personal side, I was born in South Africa, and my father was into nature conservation. And so when we immigrated to the UK, I was about 12, and very fortunately, my family went out into the bush with a guy called Ian Player, who's the brother of Gary Player, the South African golfer, and he was a big nature conservationist, and his tracker called Makubu. And we stayed in the bush for 10 days, tracking lion on foot and washing in rivers with crocodiles and sitting by the campfire at night and listening to the animals. And so that was a sort of seminal moment, I guess, in my life, and something that stayed with me forever. Just seeing those majestic animals in their natural habitat has always been something which, I was keen to preserve. And then between that age of 12 to about 24 or 25, I guess I was just like any normal child and just, interested in life and not so much in the environment. But I started working for Coca Cola based in Hong Kong, and was fortunate enough to sort of work up the organization on the commercial side of the business, and eventually ran what we called immediate consumption, which was the profitable side of the business. And we were looking to grow the business 4 times in terms of size and 10 times in terms of profit over a 5-year period. And the key to doing that was really making sure that we got our product within arm's reach of desire of the consumer, and we got it at the right temperature so that when a consumer tried the product, they had the best experience and would come back and repeat purchase. In order to do that, we were about to place millions of coolers, refrigeration in the marketplace, and refrigeration was the largest greenhouse gas footprint for the Coca-Cola company at the time. And so we redesigned our coolers to be more energy efficient, and so we reduced energy consumption by 40%. That had a cost burden to it. And I found it was at the time when the Kyoto Protocol had come on, and there was this market-based mechanism to encourage developing markets to do the right thing in terms of placing equipment in the future. And so you could do carbon trading. And that to me was incredibly exciting as a businessman, to find a way to reduce your costs and do the right things. And so then I became really interested in sustainability. I'd also lived in China at that stage for 10, 15 years or so, and seen this incredible development where you brought 500 million people out of abject poverty, and the economic growth was phenomenal, but it was certainly at the expense of the environment. And so a lot of the cities were very polluted, etc. And so it became a sort of a passion of mine to see how we could try and change stuff. And I was very fortunate that Coke at that time were facing some headwinds in terms of obesity, water usage, packaging. waste and had started to look at sustainability, a program we called Living Positively, in order to address all those issues. And I was fortunate enough to be able to run that for them. And that's where the sort of passion started.
Thank you. That's really helpful just to frame our discussion. And I always think it's interesting to hear kind of how people's passion in sustainability started. And a lot of it is childhood memories around being in the natural world. And having been to South Africa and seen how beautiful the country is, I can imagine that it definitely sparked an interest in sustainability. I want to turn now to Good Fuel Group. So at Good Fuel Group, you offer sustainable advisory. And so I'd like to kind of ask you about best practices for corporate sustainability planning. In your work at Good Fuel Group, you have developed a 12-step process to help companies integrate sustainability throughout their firm. And I wanted to see if you could give us an overview of kind of this method and what are the most crucial steps in your mind?
Yeah, great question, Emilie. Yeah, we have at the Good Fuel Group, and that's www.goodfuelgroup.com. And you can go into the detail of our 12-step process there. But we have a tried and tested 12-step process, basically taking people from what we call materiality to reporting and everything in between. And I'll go into what I mean by materiality in a minute. But basically, we break it down into three primary buckets. One is understanding your current state as an organization, then looking at your ambition of where you want to get to and how to embed sustainability into the organization. And the third area is how do you amplify that outside of the organization, up and down your value chain, and do the reporting side of things. So in that first sort of section, what we find is that a lot of companies are doing a lot of good things in isolated pockets. And they're just diluting that good behavior by doing other behavior and not focusing all their resources around one or two primary areas. But the sort of starting point is really to look at the governance structure in the business and to develop a steering committee, a sustainability steering committee of a cross-functional team that you bring together. That steering committee needs to report into the CEO and the board. And it's so important that, number one, you get CEO buy-in and that he or she becomes the sustainability champion and really leads from the front. And even though the resource behind it may be under a chief sustainability officer or someone like that, the chief executive really needs to be the one that is the face of sustainability and understands that it is what will drive the business going forwards in terms of aligning with the overall business strategy. So that's a key component to making sure that your initiative is a success. The next thing that you do is with that cross-functional team is go out and collect all the stuff that you're doing and decide what you should start, stop, and continue. And as I said, there's usually a lot of great initiatives out there. And the key is really to focus on one or two big initiatives that your company want to own and make sure that you put all your resource behind that so that everyone understands that your company is known for, that particular issue. The third thing that we do is we start trying to understand what our impact is today. So a thing called a life cycle cost analysis. And that traditionally was done on an individual product, but we now do organizational life cycle cost analysis. And that's really to understand the impact that we have in terms of water, CO2 emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And that's more scientific, and you need to have people with real knowledge of emissions factors, et cetera, in order to make sure that that's robust and understood by the wider community. And the third thing is doing what we call a materiality assessment. So materiality really is what issues are material to your business in the medium to long term. So what is either a risk or an opportunity to the business going forwards. So traditionally, when companies report, they do their financial reporting, and that's a snapshot of where they are today. But there's no sort of forward guidance on what might happen to the business in the future based on headwinds or tailwinds that are coming up. And so suddenly a sustainability report has become a great piece of collateral for investors to see that a company truly understands what the issues are going forwards and has a plan on how to mitigate those or to accelerate them depending if they're risks or opportunities. And materiality is done in a very specific way where you start out with a stakeholder analysis, understand who your stakeholders are, both internally and externally, both those that are detractors and those that are pro the company. And you go out and actually engage them. So there's an interview process where you go out and engage your stakeholders, understand their feelings of where the business is and what the issues are. And then you come back as a group and you discuss, okay, these are what our stakeholders think. This is what we can influence. And you put it into a matrix. And what ends up in the top right-hand corner are your primary issues, which you should go after. And so the key there is really engaging stakeholders and bringing them on the journey with you, making sure that their voice is heard so that you have no surprises in the future where a detractor might throw a landmine in front of you. You may disagree with the timing of what's happening, but at least they see there's intent to move in the right direction, etc. And in fact, some of your detractors can become your greatest advocates if you do that process properly. Generally, a business could sit down what their material issues are themselves, but the key here is going through that process of making sure you bring your stakeholders along the journey with you. And once you have all that information, you sort of understand your current state and where you are. The next thing is to sit down with management and understand, where do we want to be? What do we want to do around these issues? Do we want to be carbon neutral in 5 years? Do we want to be carbon neutral in 10 years? And all those decisions are incredibly important, and start focusing your company and your strategy in a very particular direction. And so that's the sort of hardest part, I guess, of the whole process, is making sure you get the whole business aligned around that ambition, aligned around where you want to go in that vision. And it should be totally intertwined with your business strategic direction. As long as they're together, you've got a real chance of being successful. So there we have the sort of vision and ambition. And once you know that, you put KBIs or OKRs against those different areas and put in place a management and measuring system, so you can start actually seeing how you're performing over time and making sure you're going in the right direction. The key is, once you've got those in place, is to really bring the organization along with you. So you have a series of change management workshops showing what they can do as individuals, what you're doing as a company, and where you ultimately want to get to as a company. So full immersion days, etc. And that's a key component to bring the whole organization along the journey. And then the third area really is amplifying outside of the organization. So once you've started doing great stuff and you've got your house in order internally, making sure that you start broadening that out down your supply chain. So making sure that you have supplier scorecards where people are judged based on their environmental credentials, making sure that you're sharing some of the great, good best practice that you've done to your suppliers and to your customers, and trying to really amplify the good work that you're doing outside. And this is all put together in a sustainability report, which is published annually. So you've now made your ambition public and how you're progressing against that public, so that people can hold you accountable as you go forwards.
Thank you. I think that's a very helpful overview, and it aligns very well with how KBRA approaches ESG issues in our rating process. So as you know, for corporations, we focus on the active management of financially relevant ESG issues, including the strategy for mitigating ESG risks and capitalizing on ESG opportunities, with particular focus on, as you mentioned, stakeholder engagement. I'd like to turn now to your role at Didi, where you oversaw the company's international sustainability efforts. Obviously, greening the transportation sector is a crucial part of the low carbon transition, as transport represents a large share of global emissions. So how did you help the company work to lower its carbon footprint in the areas it operates?
Absolutely. Transportation accounts for about 24% of global emissions. So Didi is the largest ride-sharing company in the world. And I'm not just saying anything that's not public at the moment, but if you look at our SEC F1 filings for 2021, Didi had about 500 million annual active users and about 15 million annual active drivers. So the company offers ride sharing, food delivery, and fintech. And the largest market that we operate in is obviously China. And then outside of China, we have a large focus on LATAM, in particular Mexico and Brazil, which are our largest markets in LATAM. And I think, as I said, 24% of global emissions are coming through transportation. So we had a huge opportunity to take a big ding out of that with our ride sharing and delivery businesses. And there are two real innovations that are happening within the auto industry, which I think are very pertinent to the environmental side of things. The first is the EV or electric vehicle innovation. And that obviously depends a bit on your source of electricity. Presuming you come from a renewable energy source or a green energy source, then it has significant impact on emissions. At Didi, we had over 1 million EVs in our fleet, and that's primarily in China. And what we found was that when a driver drives an EV as opposed to a gas car, they actually earn 40% more money. So their total cost of ownership goes down by 40%, and that's more money in their pockets. And for us, that's essential because if you're earning more, the job becomes more appealing, and therefore we get more drivers on the platform, and therefore your wait time as a user goes down. And as a result, the whole system works more efficiently and effectively, and you get more users on the platform, more jobs for the drivers, etc. And so it was a sort of a nice synergy in the sense that the move to EVs actually helps our business. And so we'd seen this in China. A lot of the legislation that was put in place by the Chinese government actually in terms of incentives and sticks really moved the EV adoption in the right direction, and we benefited from that. The transition to EVs really has had a huge impact in reducing emissions from the transportation sector. The second thing we found was that only 10% of our drivers were females. And again, with inflationary pressures in terms of the cost of gas and the COVID epidemic, what we found was that we were being constrained in terms of drivers. And so to try and get more females to drive on the platform was not only a benefit from the S point of view, but also a benefit for the business. So again, if we could get more drivers in EVs and more female drivers, then the whole flywheel effect for our business would increase. The second disruption that the auto industry is facing, and arguably one that will be even more impactful from an environmental point of view, is the move to autonomy or self-driving cars or robo-taxis. And Didi has a lab in Mountain View working on this technology. Sort of mobility as a service will sort of eliminate the need for about 9 out of 10 cars on the roads in the US. And that's a think tank called Rethink X has come up with that number. Statistics which always amazes me is that 90% of our cars 90% of the time are not used. And so imagine if all those cars that are sitting in garages, sitting in parking lots, etc., were eliminated, would suddenly really change the way that society functions and that society and our cities are planned. Changing car parks into parks, adding an extra bedroom where you've got a double garage, etc., and at the same time reducing the carbon emissions from vehicles, I think is a huge, huge impact. And so for Didi, in a way, we are a sustainability business in the sense that we're driving both EV adoption and autonomous vehicle adoption ultimately.
So interesting. I want to stay on Didi for a second. And Didi is headquartered in Beijing, but operates in many other countries such as Japan, Brazil, Mexico. I'm assuming that the structural barriers to making Didi's business model more sustainable varies by these different countries. How did you navigate this?
Yeah, so different legislation in various countries might mean that we tweak certain aspects of the model. However, as I said previously, our industry is very fortunate that our sustainability goals are completely aligned with our business goals. So by lowering the cost for drivers, putting more money in their pocket, while at the same time offering employment to as many people as possible, these goals are sort of aligned with the direction governments and the auto industry is going. But the speed at which that change happens is very dependent on governments. And so the Chinese government was very active in pushing EVs for the last 10 years or so by incentivizing production and purchases. And that has made a real material change in the field, and they've become a leader in EV technology globally. With Brazil, a core component of the strategy was to work. We'd set up a mobility alliance to lobby the government, but also to make sure that all the different key stakeholders in really moving the industry in the right direction were aligned on what we're trying to do. So the alliance includes OEMs, original equipment manufacturers like the car companies. It includes infrastructure individuals who are putting in place charging stations, etc. It includes generators of electricity and includes government bodies as well. And so the key is to try and sort of frame it in a way that the government understands in order to try and make sure that they incentivize and move things in the right direction. And so, things like in Sao Paulo, 66,000 people died prematurely of pollution-related deaths due to transportation. And so getting the government to understand that, and if we clean the environment, then you would reduce that health crisis. And at the same time, the government actually earns in Brazil more tax dollars out of electricity than it does out of gas. And so again, showing them that they could get more dollars in the treasury by moving to electric vehicles than they would with gas is another way to sort of inspire them to put in legislation to move the country in the right direction.
So we focused a lot on the E throughout this conversation, but sustainability and ESG also incorporates promoting social development and societal well-being. You touched on gender diversity and employment, but I'd like to know a little bit more on how you integrate social issues into your sustainability work.
Yeah, again, with Didi, we're very fortunate with the business model that, as I said, we have 15 million active annual drivers on our platform. So millions of people globally are able to earn a flexible income. And in many developing countries, that actually is the safety net. Certainly we saw with the pandemic, a lot of people losing jobs. And fortunately, the likes of ride hailing were there so that they could continue to earn a salary and feed their families. So from a social impact point of view, we see again our business model being very aligned with the S component of ESG. Basically, if you could walk, you can deliver food. If you can drive and have a car, you can work on our platform. The barrier to entry is very, very low. And so we see that as a huge social benefit that comes to the countries in which we operate. Another large focus on the social side, as you mentioned, is diversity, equity, and inclusion, or now the term people are using is JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is internal and external. And two different focuses, really. Obviously, internally at Didi, we were very committed to making sure that, there was equity in terms of inclusion regarding hiring policies, pay, compensation, and the company composition. But even more than this, in the partner pool, ensuring that we bring more females into employment. And there's also a component which we're very proud of, which is in a lot of the developing world, ride hailing is actually a lot safer than using public transportation. And so there's a lot of exclusion as a result of where you live, your socioeconomic class, not being able to get to a job that you want to, not being able to get to study in a place that you want to, purely from a point of transportation and not being able to get there. So again, there's ramifications and implications of the ride-hailing industry, which have benefited society hugely. And so, that I think is, interestingly, with the business model of ride-hailing, it's very integrated with what we're trying to do from a business point of view. And so it amplifies through that, which is very exciting. Another example, let's say, for example, you're a confectionery company and, obviously the obesity epidemic is a huge issue. You may try and do campaigns around that to get people moving, reducing serving sizes, for example, or bringing fitness programs to schools and things like that. So it really is looking at what is important to your business, what is the material issue around your business, and then making sure you have a cause which all of your CSR activities, the focus of your investment goes behind that one big issue so that you can be known in the market for that issue going forwards.
Well, this has been such an interesting conversation and really helpful in terms of corporate best practices and sustainability. So, Hamish, the last thing I want to ask you is something that we like to ask on ESG Talks. And since you've been involved in sustainability in one form or another for the bulk of your career, I want to get your thoughts on, when it comes to climate mitigation and the world's transition to a low carbon economy, what keeps you up at night and what really gives you the most hope?
Great question. I've recently had a big landmark birthday. I was born in 1972, and so I just turned 50. And a friend of mine gave me a cup that had every data from 1972. And so if you look back, the population when I was born of the world was 3.8 billion people, and it's now 8 billion, so more than doubled just in my lifetime. And all of those people obviously aspire to live the life of an average American, and they should. But the problem is we just don't have the resources to allow them to do that if we continue to consume and live in the way that we do today. So the thing that really keeps me up at night is the slow pace and scale of change. We're against the clock. We're moving too slowly. And I think the big learning over all those years of being in sustainability is that behavior change is hard, if not impossible, right? We're humans and we like convenience and we like the easy way out. And so that's why, for me, hope really lies in technical innovation. And I see this in three primary areas, which will hopefully keep us under the 1.5 that we need to stay alive, basically. And those are, one is energy production. And as we look at wind, solar, batteries, the price of those has come down so considerably over the last 10 years that it's now cheaper in most parts of the world to use wind, solar, and batteries than it is to use coal fire. And that, as a consumer, I just turn on my light. I don't really know where that electricity has come from, but it's getting greener. And that I think is fantastic. So that's the one area where I see innovation, technical innovation as really helping transform how we live. The second is transportation, and we've spoken a lot about that in terms of electric vehicles and then autonomous vehicles. And again, the price and the technology is improving every day. And so ultimately, I think you'll see people having transportation as a service where you pay a monthly fee and the robo taxi will pick you up and take you where you need to go. And again, as I said, as we get to autonomy in America, it's predicted that you'd need only 1/10 of the cars, which has a huge impact in terms of the environment. And the third, and I think potentially the largest area of disruption from technical innovation that could really help us reach the targets we need to in a time frame that we need to, is the disruption of industrial agriculture. And that comes through a technology called precision fermentation, where you can grow protein from a cell. So instead of having milk from a cow, it's grown in a vat. And as a result of that, the whole industrial agriculture supply chain gets disrupted incredibly. No longer do you need feed for the animals in the sort of amounts that we use. No longer do you need the pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers that we use today. And all of that will have a huge impact in reducing emissions. So that's sort of what keeps me hopeful. And that's where sort of I focus. And I hope we can accelerate that at a rate needed in order to ensure that we don't get over that 1.5 degrees. I mean, every day we're reading new reports from different government bodies on how things are accelerating faster than we'd ever possibly imagined. And even today on the BBC, there was an article about the sea temperature rising faster than they'd predicted and not really knowing why. So, yeah, I live in hope, but I certainly am kept up at night by the slowness of the pace of change.
I think that's definitely well put. And I definitely agree with you on sort of the hope that there is in technical innovation. So be interesting to watch the development over the next few years. But Hamish, I want to thank you so much for joining me for a very, very interesting episode. And I think it will be very useful to our listeners. Thanks so much.
Emilie, thanks so much for your time. And thanks to KBRA and KlimateNet for putting this all together. I really appreciate it.
This concludes our episode. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter.